My husband had barely closed the door behind him when I felt a mix of relief and excitement wash over me. A whole weekend to myself, I thought, a rare treat these days. We had kissed goodbye, and he promised to call every night from his military training exercise. It was supposed to be a quiet few days. I spent that first evening luxuriating in the newfound solitude. A long, hot bath with lavender-scented bubbles, a glass of rich red wine, and the house blissfully silent. It was perfect. I wrapped myself in a fluffy robe, sank into the couch, and flipped through TV channels without a care in the world. Just as I was about to doze off, a knock at the door jolted me awake. Glancing at the clock, I saw it was almost midnight. Who could that be? I wondered, my heart skipping a beat. Peering through the peephole, I recognized my husband's military buddies. They stood there, looking apologetic and a bit sheepish. "Hey, sorry to bother you so late," one of them said as I opened the door. "We got off base and didn't have anywhere to crash for the night. Could we maybe stay here?" Caught off guard but unable to turn them away, I nodded and stepped aside. "Of course, come in," I said, forcing a smile. As they filed in, I quickly tidied up the living room, hoping they wouldn't notice my unease. I offered them drinks and snacks, trying to make them feel at home. We chatted about their training exercises, and they shared funny stories about my husband. The atmosphere was comfortable, almost like a casual get-together. As the night wore on, the conversations took a turn. Their compliments became more personal, more suggestive. "You're even more beautiful than he said," one remarked, his eyes lingering a bit too long. "Your husband is a lucky man," another chimed in, his voice low and smooth. I felt a mix of embarrassment and flattery. It had been a while since I received such attention. Then came the first proposition. "How about a game to make the night more interesting?" one of them suggested, a mischievous glint in his eye. I hesitated, feeling a thrill and a pang of guilt simultaneously. "What kind of game?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Something with stakes," he replied, leaning in closer. The air grew thick with anticipation. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We started with simple dares, but the game quickly escalated. Before I knew it, I was in compromising positions, their hands and eyes all over me. I felt both embarrassed and excited by their attention, a dangerous cocktail of emotions. As the game continued, I found myself crossing lines I never thought I would. Each touch, each whisper, pushed me further into unfamiliar territory. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, but my body responded to their advances with a fervor that surprised even me. By the end of the night, I was left breathless and dazed, caught in a web of desire and betrayal. The reality of what had happened was just starting to sink in, but I couldn't deny the thrill that had coursed through me. This weekend was turning out to be anything but ordinary, and as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. I couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes on me as I moved around the kitchen, pouring drinks and pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal. I kept replaying the events of the night before in my head, wondering how things had escalated so quickly. The knock on my bedroom door brought me back to reality. One of the men stood there, a mischievous grin on his face. "Care to join me?" he asked, his voice low and suggestive. My heart raced. This was it, the moment I had been dreading and, if I was honest with myself, anticipating. He led me to the bedroom, and before I knew it, we were in the midst of a passionate encounter. The thrill was overwhelming. His hands were everywhere, and I felt a surge of excitement and fear. This was so wrong, but I couldn't deny the rush it gave me. To my surprise, I found myself enjoying the forbidden nature of the situation. I felt desired and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. Each touch, each whisper, heightened my senses. It was like a drug, intoxicating and addictive. The night blurred into a haze of pleasure and disbelief. Each of my husband's colleagues took their turn, treating me as their own. I was lost in the sensations, unable to distinguish one moment from the next. It was as if I had stepped into another world, one where boundaries didn't exist. As the early morning light filtered through the curtains, I lay in bed, feeling a mix of guilt and exhilaration. What had I done? My mind raced with the implications, but my body still hummed with the afterglow of pleasure. The conflict within me was almost unbearable. The next morning was surreal. The men acted as if nothing had happened. We had breakfast together, chatting casually about mundane topics. They thanked me for my hospitality, their eyes betraying nothing of the night's events. I felt like I was living in a bizarre alternate reality. Just as I was starting to believe I could compartmentalize the night, my husband called. His voice was cheerful, and he asked how my night had been. A pang of guilt hit me hard. How could I talk to him, knowing what had happened? I forced myself to sound normal, answering his questions and pretending everything was fine. The rest of the day was a strange juxtaposition of normalcy and hidden turmoil. We spent the day watching TV, playing games, and eating together. The men joked and laughed as if we were old friends, but every touch and glance reminded me of the night before. It was a constant, silent tension that I couldn't escape. I couldn't help but reflect on the stark contrast between the mundane activities of the day and the shocking, thrilling events of the night. It felt like I was living two different lives, each pulling me in opposite directions. As I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I realized this weekend was far from over. The implications of what had happened, and what might still happen, loomed over me like a dark cloud. And so, I waited, caught between fear and anticipation, wondering what the night would bring next. I should have known it wasn't over. The house was quiet, but my mind was anything but. Last night felt like a fever dream, something so surreal I could almost convince myself it hadn't happened. Almost. The guilt lingered, mixing with an unwanted anticipation for what might come next. Evening came, and with it, the inevitable suggestion from the men. "How about we have a few more drinks?" One of them proposed, his eyes locking onto mine with a knowing look. I felt a shiver of excitement and dread. I knew where this was heading. Despite my better judgment, I nodded, and we gathered in the living room, drinks in hand. As the alcohol flowed, the men's advances grew bolder and more direct. They seemed more confident, their touches more insistent. They knew I had already crossed the line, and I felt my resistance crumbling. It was intoxicating, this forbidden attention. I found myself participating more willingly, almost eagerly. Their hands on me, their voices in my ear, it was all consuming. I was losing myself in the physical pleasure, surrendering to the moment. During a break, as we sat in a circle, one of the men leaned in close. "You know, your husband suggested we come over," he said casually, like he was discussing the weather. His words hit me like a slap. My husband knew? He had planned this? A mix of anger and confusion boiled inside me. Why would he do this? Did he want me to cheat on him? I couldn't hold back. "What do you mean he suggested it?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man didn't flinch. He explained that my husband wanted to test my loyalty. He knew I had been feeling neglected, and this was his twisted way of addressing it. I felt a surge of anger. My husband had orchestrated this entire situation, knowing what might happen. My mind raced with questions, but deep down, a part of me understood. I had been feeling neglected, and now, here I was, surrounded by men who desired me, who made me feel wanted. The thrill was undeniable. I struggled with the revelation, but as the night wore on, I found myself accepting it. If this was what my husband wanted, if this was his way of reconnecting, who was I to refuse? The attention, the thrill, it was all too tempting. I let go of my anger, surrendering to the situation. As the men resumed their advances, I embraced the moment, losing myself once again in the sensations. It was a heady mix of guilt and pleasure, confusion and acceptance. The night stretched on, each moment blurring into the next. By the end, as I lay in bed, the house quiet once more, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had crossed lines I never thought I would, but in doing so, I had found something unexpected. A part of me was still angry, still hurt, but another part was exhilarated by the freedom, the attention. I realized then that this weekend was more than just a test of loyalty. It was a test of myself, of my desires and boundaries. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, and I knew today was going to be different. The shock and guilt of the past nights were still there, but something had changed. I understood my husband's plan now, and it was time to embrace it fully. If this was what he wanted, I would give it to him. I made my way downstairs, the smell of coffee filling the air. The men were already up, chatting casually in the kitchen. I felt a strange sense of power as I joined them. "Good morning," I greeted, my voice steady. They looked up, surprised but pleased by my confidence. Taking a more active role in the encounters was a game changer. Instead of being a passive participant, I started directing the activities, surprising the men with my newfound confidence and willingness. They followed my lead, the dynamic shifting as I took control. I enjoyed the power I had over them, the way they looked at me, the way they obeyed my commands. Throughout the day, we took breaks, engaging in normal activities like cooking and watching movies. It was bizarre, the contrast between our casual daytime interactions and the intense encounters at night. We laughed, joked, and acted like a group of friends. But the underlying tension was always there, a constant reminder of what was to come. When my husband called, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. "How's your weekend going?" he asked, his tone light. I could hear the curiosity behind his words. "It's been interesting," I replied, a smile playing on my lips. Talking to him, knowing I was fulfilling his unspoken desires, gave me a thrill I hadn't expected. As night fell, the tension in the air was palpable. The men were eager to continue, and I found myself looking forward to it. The anticipation was electric, charging the atmosphere with an almost tangible energy. The encounters that night were more intense and varied. Each man pushed my boundaries further, testing my limits. The sensations were overwhelming, each touch, each whisper, driving me to new heights of pleasure. I embraced the experience, losing myself in the moment, in the control, and in the desire. I could feel the shift in our group dynamics. The men were more deferential, more eager to please. They enjoyed my dominance, my confidence. I had transformed from a passive participant to the one in control, and it was exhilarating. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each encounter more intense than the last. I reveled in the power I held, the way they looked at me, the way they responded to my commands. I felt a deep connection to my husband, even though he wasn't there. This was his plan, his way of reconnecting with me, and I was fully embracing it. By the time the sun began to rise, I was exhausted but satisfied. I had pushed my limits, explored new dynamics, and discovered a side of myself I hadn't known existed. As I lay in bed, the house quiet once more, I couldn't help but reflect on the weekend's events. This weekend had changed me. It had tested my boundaries, my loyalty, and my desires. I had discovered a new sense of confidence and power, a new understanding of my relationship with my husband. The events of the weekend were far from over, but I was ready to face whatever came next. Just as the last man finished with me, I heard the door open. The sound echoed through the room, jolting me from the haze of exhaustion and pleasure. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to see who it was. There, standing in the doorway, was my husband, flanked by more of his military buddies. My breath caught in my throat. What was he doing here? His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the shock flash across his face. But it lasted only a moment before it morphed into a grin that sent shivers down my spine. "Looks like the weekend's just getting started," he announced, his voice carrying an unsettling mix of amusement and authority. He stepped aside, allowing the new men to file in, and my mind raced with a mix of fear, excitement, anger, and anticipation. The room buzzed with energy as my husband introduced the new men, explaining that they would be joining the fun. I was stunned, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I felt like I was on the edge of a precipice, teetering between fear and exhilaration. "Let's make this a night to remember," my husband declared, his eyes never leaving mine. There was a challenge in his gaze, a dare to embrace the chaos. And so, I did. My body moved on autopilot, responding to his commands and the touches of the men around me. It was a chaotic mix of pleasure and confusion, each moment blending into the next in a whirlwind of sensations. My husband joined in, directing the men and participating himself. His presence added a new layer to the experience, intensifying everything. The lines between dominant and submissive blurred as I found myself taking on different roles. Sometimes I was in control, relishing the power and the reactions I elicited. Other times, I surrendered completely, letting them take the lead and push my boundaries. The night was a blur of shifting dynamics and raw emotions. Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, I felt an intense connection with my husband. This twisted scenario, as strange and unsettling as it was, seemed to bring us closer. In the midst of the confusion and the physicality, there was a sense of understanding and acceptance between us. As the hours passed, I lost track of time. The room was filled with the sounds of pleasure and exertion, the smell of sweat and lust hanging heavy in the air. Each encounter pushed me further, testing my limits and revealing new facets of my desires. I embraced the experience fully, letting go of all inhibitions and immersing myself in the moment. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, the intensity finally began to ebb. The men started to drift away, leaving my husband and me alone. The room was silent, the earlier chaos replaced by an almost eerie calm. We lay there, side by side, not speaking but understanding each other completely. This weekend had been a test, a journey into the unknown, and we had come out the other side changed. There was a strange sense of peace and connection between us, a bond forged in the fires of our shared experience. In that quiet moment, I realized that this was more than just a weekend of debauchery. It was a journey of discovery, a test of our relationship and our boundaries. We had explored the depths of our desires and found a new understanding of each other. As we lay there, exhausted but content, I knew that our relationship had been irrevocably altered. Whether it was for better or worse remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The weekend had been shocking, intense, and unforgettable. It had tested our limits and revealed new facets of our desires and our relationship. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. We had faced the storm together and come out the other side, forever changed but still standing. The morning after was surreal. The house buzzed with activity as my husband's colleagues moved around, their presence a constant reminder of the previous night's chaos. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, blending with the lingering sense of sweat and sex. We gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast, an odd mix of camaraderie and tension hanging over us. I picked at my food, my mind racing. The men treated me with a curious mix of respect and desire, glancing at my husband for cues. It was clear they saw me differently now, a new normal settling in. My husband seemed to revel in the attention I received, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he observed the interactions. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of his plan, a twisted game he was enjoying far too much. As the day wore on, my husband and I engaged in subtle power plays. He enjoyed watching me with other men, directing them with an authority that both thrilled and unnerved me. I found myself slipping into different roles, experimenting with my own desires and boundaries. But despite the physical pleasure, a growing emotional disconnect from my husband gnawed at me. The situation was too surreal, too detached from reality. Some of the men began to stand out, becoming more involved in the story. One in particular, a close friend of my husband's named Mark, became a central figure. He was different from the others, calmer, more understanding. He seemed to sense my internal struggle and offered a quiet support that I desperately needed. One afternoon, while the others were occupied, I found myself alone with Mark. We sat on the back porch, the air thick with unspoken words. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. I sighed, the weight of the past days pressing down on me. "I don't know, Mark. This whole thing, it's too much. I don't understand why he's doing this." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "He's testing you, pushing your limits. But you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here if you need someone to talk to." His words were a lifeline, a source of comfort in the storm. I confided in him, sharing my mixed feelings about the situation. Mark listened, offering support and understanding without judgment. He became my confidant, a steady presence amidst the chaos. As the weekend progressed, the encounters escalated. New men joined in, each bringing their own energy to the mix. The activities became more extreme, my husband pushing my boundaries further with each passing hour. The physical sensations were overwhelming, but the emotional toll was starting to show. One evening, as I lay in bed recovering from another intense encounter, my husband sat beside me. "You're doing great," he murmured, his hand resting on my thigh. "I knew you had it in you." I looked at him, a mixture of anger and exhaustion in my eyes. "Why, though? Why push me like this?" He shrugged, a lazy smile on his face. "I wanted to see how far you'd go. To see if you could handle it. And you have. You've done more than handle it, you've thrived." His words hung in the air, a bitter validation of his twisted game. I realized then that this wasn't just about testing me. It was about control, about seeing how far he could push before I broke. And despite everything, I hadn't broken. I had discovered new depths of strength and resilience within myself, even as the emotional disconnect between us grew. The weekend was drawing to a close, but the lessons learned and the scars left would linger long after. As I lay there, the house finally quieting down, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange journey we had taken. It was a journey of betrayal and discovery, of power and submission. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that our relationship would never be the same again. I never thought I'd see my husband jealous, especially not after everything he'd set in motion this weekend. But there it was, plain as day in his eyes, whenever Mark was near me. The tension was palpable, and I could feel it growing between them. It was like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. The jealousy first showed its ugly head when Mark and I were alone on the porch talking. My husband walked out, and his face hardened at the sight of us together. I could almost hear his thoughts, seething beneath the surface. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tight. "Just talking," I replied, trying to keep things light. But I knew he wasn't buying it. The situation was spiraling, and I felt caught in the middle, unsure of where my loyalties should lie. That night, the tension reached a boiling point. My husband confronted Mark in front of everyone, his voice dripping with anger. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" he demanded. Mark stood his ground, not backing down. "Just being a friend, something she needs right now." The room fell silent, all eyes on them. I held my breath, feeling the weight of their confrontation. This was more than just a power struggle, it was about me, and the roles we had all fallen into over the weekend. Somehow, we managed to reach a temporary truce, deciding to continue the weekend as planned. But the atmosphere was tense and charged with emotion. The group dynamics shifted as the men began to take sides. Some supported my husband, standing by his authority, while others sympathized with me, seeing the toll it was taking on me. Amid the chaos, I found myself sharing more intimate moments with Mark. Our connection deepened, complicating the situation further. He was a source of comfort, someone who understood the conflict raging inside me. But every touch, every whispered word, added another layer to the mess we were in. Nightly rituals continued, each encounter blending into the next. It became a routine, something I participated in almost mechanically. I found myself growing more detached, focusing solely on the physical sensations to numb the emotional turmoil. It was easier that way, to just lose myself in the moment and forget the reality of what was happening. But the emotional distance between my husband and me grew wider. I felt like a pawn in his game, a means to an end, losing sight of my own desires and needs. The initial thrill was gone, replaced by a deep-seated resentment and confusion. What was this all for? What were we trying to prove? As the weekend drew to a close, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled in my chest. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. The lessons learned and the scars left would linger long after the men were gone. I knew our relationship had been irrevocably altered, but I couldn't tell if it was for better or worse. One thing was certain. This weekend had tested us in ways I never imagined. It had pushed our boundaries, revealed hidden desires, and exposed the cracks in our relationship. And as I lay in bed that final night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that our journey was far from over. The fallout from this weekend would shape our future in ways we had yet to understand. I hit my breaking point one morning as I stood in the shower, the hot water scalding my skin but failing to wash away the turmoil inside me. My reflection in the foggy mirror looked like a stranger. I couldn't go on like this. The constant tension, the jealousy, the emotional disconnect, it was all taking a toll on my mental and physical health. Something had to give. I found my husband in the kitchen, sipping his coffee like nothing was wrong. My heart pounded as I walked up to him, anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained emotion. He looked up, surprised by the intensity in my voice. "What's wrong?" he asked, but I could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I can't do this anymore," I blurted out. "This whole weekend, it's tearing me apart. I need answers. Why did you do this? Why put me through all of this?" He sighed, setting his coffee cup down. "I wanted to test your loyalty," he admitted, not meeting my eyes. "And explore some of my own fantasies." His words felt like a punch to the gut. All this chaos, all this pain, just to satisfy his curiosity and desires? I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "Well, congratulations," I snapped. "You've succeeded in breaking me. But this stops now. You have to choose. End this weekend's activities or risk losing me forever." He looked taken aback, clearly not expecting an ultimatum. We stared at each other for a long moment before he nodded slowly. Okay, he said, let's talk. We sat down at the kitchen table, the place where so much had started just a few days ago. This time, though, it wasn't a casual chat over breakfast. It was a raw, honest conversation about our desires, our boundaries, and our relationship. For the first time in months, we talked openly and honestly. We laid everything out on the table, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It was a painful conversation, but a necessary one. We both cried, we both yelled, but ultimately, we both listened. We realized how far we had drifted from each other and how much work we had to do to rebuild our trust. We need to end this, I said, finally. Send them away. We need to focus on us now. He agreed, and together, we told the men it was time to leave. There were some grumbles and surprised looks, but they respected our decision. As the last of them walked out the door, a heavy silence fell over the house. It felt almost eerie after the constant noise and activity of the past few days. We were left to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward. The house, once full of tension and desire, now felt empty and quiet. It was just the two of us again, and we had a long road ahead. Rebuilding trust was not going to be easy. We started by spending more time together, just talking and reconnecting. We set new boundaries and made promises to each other, promises we both knew would be hard to keep but were committed to trying. We began attending therapy, both individually and as a couple. It was hard, confronting the issues that had driven us apart, but it was also cathartic. Slowly, we started to understand each other better, to see the pain and the desires that had led us down this path. One night, as we sat on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background, my husband took my hand. I'm sorry, he said, his voice full of regret. I pushed you too far. I squeezed his hand, feeling a tentative warmth in my heart. We both did, I replied. But we're trying to fix it. That's what matters. The road to healing was long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. We had faced the storm and come out the other side, scarred but still standing. And maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to